Okay. All right.
If I say it's not, it's not.
All right, everyone. Okay.
Kind of spicy down.
Yeah, whoa. Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. All right, we are continuing on in James chapter 1. We're in verse 13 through 18. So we'll read that, and then I've got a question for you. Yeah, it says, 13 says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures." All right. So my first question here is why does James insert this section here? Because he's just got done talking about when we persevere as believers through trials and tribulations, that we are going to have two benefits of that. Number one is we're going to be blessed. We're going to be happy and joyful in the midst of, not because of, but in the midst of that, and we'll be happy in this life and the next life. And then he also said that we'll be promised a crown of life. So James just set this up. He's commanded us to be joyful. He's commanded us to persevere. He's told us the benefits of perseverance as believers. What is the reason now for him to jump in and say, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted of God"? And feels like it's like, oh, okay, now James is on to some other topic, and we've just sort of shelved that. What's the transition here? Because it isn't a new topic. He is actually doing something. Yes, Rich?
So is there a difference between a temptation and a trial?
A temptation can be a trial. A trial does not have to be a temptation. Yeah, because a trial could be anything. A trial could be someone dying. It could be a health issue. It could be some financial thing. A temptation is an allurement to sin, and there may be trials where we're being severely tempted, but yet we don't sin.
Yeah,
Okay.
the reason why I asked that, and I love these verses here, is that he's very descriptive about this. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed
Yep.
by his own desire.
Yeah.
So to me, the desire that leads to temptation, or that is that is the whole cycle of temptation, to me is different than a trial. Something that, I see that, that it can be something that I struggle with, but, a lot of times trials are things that are outside that you don't necessarily have control of, whereas you're making a decision here, you're making a choice.
Yeah.
You're being
Yeah.
enticed.
So I think the distinction you're making, because they're both trials.
Right.
One of them is an internal component.
Well,
And the other one
you
is
have
usually
responsibility here.
yeah, and the other one is more of external. But the question is why does he go from talking about persevere and here's the benefits? Why does he then go to this? What's his point? In other words, what's the transition here that he's making?
Perseverance is going to be difficult, and I think there's a connection between persevering and resisting temptations and then bearing your own cross.
Yeah, it is. Here's what he says: "Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God."
We're trying to blame it on somebody else.
Correct. So what James has just done is he's told us he's commanded us to persevere. He's given us the benefits of perseverance. Now what he's going to do is he's going to say, now hold on a second here. I'm going to sort of play the role of the interlocutor. I'm going to take a position here that people might say is, hey, James, this is all good and well. It's all good and well. However, you don't know what I'm going through, and the devil made me do it. But in this case, it's even worse. Yeah, the devil. In this case, God, you put me in this situation. This is just what Adam did with Eve. God, the woman you gave me, I couldn't do anything, right? So this is exactly what James is going to do. He's going to say, now hold on a second here. I know exactly what people are going to say. They're going to say, well, it's all good and well. Theoretically, James, what you say is good. But I can't live it. Why can't I live it? Because of temptation. And why can't I resist some temptation at least? Because it's God that gave the temptation. God can't be resisted. That's exactly what, and people say that, they blame it on the devil, but they also, you hear people say, God, you put me in this situation, whatever else. Like I hear people say, this is where it's at. So what James is trying to do is he's trying to say, okay, look, I'm going to remove any excuse you have for blaming your inability to persevere on God. And I'm going to actually tell you where that inability comes from, and it's not God, Rich, to your point, it's you. So if you're not persevering in the midst of those temptations, which are trials, don't blame God for it, right?
Well, and then he says it leads to sin, which brings forth
Death.
death.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a moment. Now, if you want to kind of see the connector of this section in James, you can go down to James chapter 4, verses 1 through 8, where James will, again, sort of come back and he will talk about other, basically not excuses in this case, because this right here, he's talking about excuses. In James chapter 4, verses 1 through 8, he talks about the inward motivations, the inward desires that cause us to not persevere, and frankly, because of be horrible Christians to each other and to the world. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of set that up, that he's not giving us a brand new topic here. He's going to now say, look, let's talk about this. Let's address the excuses that might come out of something like that. And what he says here, he gives kind of what I call the negative case for temptation. And the negative case is that he says negatively, temptation does not come from God, right? So it doesn't come from God, right? And he basically gives the reason for it here. He says the logical conclusion of that is because, God cannot be tempted with evil, right? So God can't be tempted with evil. And because he can't be tempted with evil, and there is no evil in him, he can tempt no one with evil, right? Evil is completely outside the sphere of God's capacity and capabilities.
You said God cannot be tempted by evil?
He cannot. Well, that James says it. God cannot be tempted with evil.
So how does that align with Jesus?
Oh, Rich, you just brought up a. Tell you what. Let's get through James. If we've got enough time, we can talk about that, because that is a. I'll just put it out there. There's a couple different perspectives on how to answer that, and it's really, you'll get a lot of people busting each other in the chops and banging a lot of heads about the view on how this is, So, because some people will say, well, Christ, because he was God, couldn't be tempted, and I say, well, if he wasn't tempted, then there wasn't really temptation, therefore, so anyway, it's not easy. It's actually, to me, the solution is actually fairly easy.
Yeah, I think it would be.
Well, but theologians argue about this all the time. So we'll just leave it. We'll just leave it there. God cannot be tempted. Jesus in his.
It's called the temptation of Christ, right?
Jesus in his divine nature cannot be tempted. His human nature, he died. He could get sick. He'd be sleepy. He got tempted to eat, like he was hungry. So, to me,
No, I get that.
okay. So that's the answer.
100%.
That's the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now the question though. Here's the question, and I want to answer it this morning. The question is because Jesus is the God-man, the divine nature and human nature, could the human nature have even sinned, because the divine nature would have had to prevent him from, in other words, that's the real question, is because the divine nature was it even possible for the human nature to sin? So I'm not going to answer that today, but that's the problem you're wrestling with theologically. All right. Anyway, so.
Well, he did.
What's that? No, he did not.
He
Yeah,
did
yeah,
not.
yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Taught us how to
Yeah.
act.
Yeah, so I just want to just read a real quick quote here about this idea of being tempted. It says the expression "God cannot be tempted" is one word in Greek, and it's only used in this verse, entire Bible. It means untemptable. God is untemptable. God is not versed in evil. God has no experience with evil. He is entirely free of evil. The author's argument is based on God's character. There's something about God's nature that simply does not allow him to be tempted, and therefore does not allow him to tempt any man in the sense of enticement to evil. Thus, God does not tempt any man with evil. The very same perfection of God that makes it impossible for him to be tempted also makes it impossible for him to tempt anyone else. While God does send parasamos, which are trials, in the sense of testing, he never sends parasamos in the sense of enticing to evil. When somebody's being tempted, enticed to evil, he cannot claim that he's being tempted by God, right? So it just goes back to God's character. God's character is such that when people say nothing's impossible with God, that's not true. There's a lot of things that are impossible with God. It's impossible for God to sin. I mean, it's literally impossible. His character will not, he can't choose to sin. We don't even understand that because we can choose to do that. God can't choose to sin. His character prevents who he is from doing that. It's like you and I can't breathe underwater unassisted. Right? Go try to just breathe underwater. You just drown. Like it's not in our nature. Try all you want. God's nature prevents him from doing that. And it's such a incredibly, like to me, powerful thought because it means, as James will go down here, God never changes. He's got no shadow of change because he can't choose to do that. He can't at some point say, you know what, I'm tired of all this whole thing. I'm going to tempt so-and-so with evil. It's impossible for him to change. His character will not allow him to do it.
I hear what you're saying, and I wrote down God's character because I was going to write like just a bullet point here. God's character prevents him from enticing some sin, from sinning, these things. But I don't like the word prevents. I don't like the guardrails on God. There's got to be a better way of saying that God's character is such that.
Well, God's character is such that it cannot happen. I mean, take the word prevent out.
He's holy, right?
Well, but his character, it's not just that he is holy, it's that he can be nothing else but holy. So there's a difference. There's a difference. Like someone could be holy, but then they could also be unholy in the next moment. God is holy, but it's also impossible for him to not be holy. Like there's no chance he could not be holy. Right? Okay.
Is it okay if I ask
Yeah.
giant can of worms question?
Oh boy. You and Rich this morning got together, yeah.
Was that a can of worms?
Didn't
That is your question was a theological can of worms. Yeah.
who created evil?
Well, no one. If you want to know the first instance, no one created evil, in the sense of a creative act by someone that says, "I'm going to now create this thing called evil," and then evil exists evil doesn't exist as an entity. It's not like you can get evil and put it into a jar or whatever else. Evil is just the absence of good. It's the absence of what should be, right? That's the real definition of evil. Evil is, in this case, anything that is opposed to God and God's will and God's plan. So evil isn't a thing
So
that was
does it
created.
pop up when Satan fell? Is that,
When his
from what we know, that's
when his
the
lust
first
and
fruit.
desires. So however that happened, because he was the choir leader, he was the head worship leader of all the angels. He led the angels in worship of God. He was the highest level of angel. And if we understand Ezekiel correctly, the earth was a gemological planet filled with all these incredible, wonderful gems, and that was basically sort of Satan's area. And it was an incredible place, and there was tons of glory and honor, and he was the top angel, and somehow he allowed the desire, and however that desire started, your point might be, how did that thing like germinate or whatever happen? don't know, it wasn't created in a creative act, because evil isn't the thing.
I mean,
It's
I'm
just,
just
Satan was
thinking
not
of
created in God's image. We were created in God's image, but we fell.
yeah.
So however, whatever Satan's character was, however, the angels.
He certainly wasn't, I'll put it this way, he was not evil from the beginning.
Yeah.
Because God can't create evil.
He was in the self, where we're into God.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
He wanted everything for himself.
yeah, he bought all
Pride
into
brought
it.
him down, and that's a
But,
good lesson to keep
but
in mind.
to your point, when you use the word created, evil wasn't created. Evil occurred.
It was allowed.
It was allowed, and somehow it germinated there, but there was no like creative act, because it's not a thing that gets created. It's just an action that goes against God and whatever God wants.
Free will.
Yeah. Well, and free will can be positive or negative, right? It can be evil or
A
not.
reaction is an opposite reaction.
Yeah. Okay. So then James goes on, he says, but each person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire. And then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death. Now, this is the positive case for temptation. So since God negatively is not the one, positively, what is the reason for temptation? Right? And James is pretty clear here that the origin of temptation is our own desires, right? And if we think about it, there are some temptations that are common to everybody, I would think, but there are definitely temptations that each one of us have that probably aren't shared by everyone in this group, right? I'm not tempted by alcohol in the slightest. I hate alcohol. Not that I hate people that I think it's totally fine to drink. I can't stand the taste of it. So you'll never find me in an AA meeting. I don't, just not my thing. I am not tempted to drink or get drunk. I'm not tempted to, never taken an illicit drug, marijuana included. I've never done it. Never in the slightest been tempted.
You and Ted Nugent have that.
Really? Really? Ted? No.
He's never
No,
he's never.
okay, I can give you personal testimony that is not true, at least in a second sense.
Oh, say, oh yeah.
That was my very first concert, and let me tell you, there was a person
Yeah,
alive there that wasn't experiencing
Okay.
a little.
Personal.
Secondhand smoke. But my point is this, is that there are things that I struggle with that may not be shared with everyone else at this table. So this is what James is saying, like these temptations come from our own desires. Now, the desire itself is not necessarily evil, right? Temptation, though, is to take a good desire that typically a good desire, and to bastardize it into something that is evil, right? Not intended.
Which might be a reason that we're allowed to be tempted, so we recognize temptation, so we would recognize sin, we would recognize deceit, like where's this feeling coming from?
Yeah.
It's not from God.
Well,
Temptation.
the reason why I mention that is because if we make an assumption, as some people do, that your desires are evil, right? Then we start to say that certain things are evil, which God never intended to be evil, right? So let's take something that the elephant in the room, sex. God created a desire, and most people, there is a desire, or at least has been some point in their life. Like there's a desire. That's God's legitimate desire, right? That is a good thing. That's a holy thing. So the desire itself for sexual fulfillment is not evil. It's actually good. It's when we're tempted to fulfill that good desire in an evil, non-godly way, right? So I want that distinction to be clear, because we have lots of desires that in and of themselves may be neutral. They may even be wholly good desires, but then we get tempted to fulfill those in ways that God never intended us to fulfill it. That's what it is. So the temptation is to take the desire and fulfill it in a way God never intended. That's what it means to be tempted, right? Because the desire itself is in there, and many times the desire is good. Now, there may be some desires that have no holy origin or connection at all, right? Like, someone who wants to torture and mutilate children. You know what I'm talking about? Like, I don't really know that I can't trace that back to a godly desire that someone's just trying to fulfill. So I'm not saying every desire is that way, but I'm saying there's a lot of desires that we have that we then struggle with in temptations that in and of themselves are either neutral or good. It's what is our reaction to them, right? That then leads, the temptation itself is not bad. It's what happens when we're tempted. So temptation is fine. Jesus was tempted. And so temptation, that's the other thing too. Temptation itself is not evil. It's what our reaction is to the temptation. Because we're guaranteed to be tempted in this life. Right? So there's a difference. And some Christians have gone off on this weird, they've gone off and they separate ourselves from the world entirely, like, monastery type of ideas came from that. That's where that idea came from, this whole separation. Because in the world we'll be tempted, their temptation is evil, therefore the way to fight evil is that way. Well, no, God never asked us to do that. He asked us to go out into the world, right? So I want those to be really, really clear that what James is talking about here are desires. Many of them are either neutral or godly, that then get warped, right? Or there may be some desires that have no godly origin or connection, okay?
I suspect there were temptations in the monastery too. So.
Here's the thing. It doesn't end. You're right. I think that's just a false premise that somehow you can isolate yourself in a concrete box someplace and not have any sort of temptation. I just don't think that works. Because here's the thing, you have actual desires, right? Now, maybe by locking yourself in a box, there's no way to fulfill that desire in an illegitimate way, therefore the temptation is less. There's maybe certain things about that, but
Monastic lifestyles that we won't do it.
yeah,
It's common to man if no temptation has overtaken you.
Correct. So anyway, what James says here, he says he uses some, and I know this is probably, Joe, you'll probably like this. He uses fishing terminology.
Yes.
These are the fishing terminology. Lured and enticed are fishing terminologies, right? And so he talks about a person is tempted when they're lured and enticed. And again, it says by our own desires, right? So there's an external temptation, but there's an internal desire that then aligns with the temptation, right? Like, I don't have any internal desire for alcohol, so alcohol never tempts me. But when I have an internal desire for, whatever it could be, for money or for power or for some other relationship other than the one that I have, like any of those things that would be in here, when that aligns with the temptation, that's what James is talking about. It's that inward desire that we have.
So I love the fishing thing.
Yeah.
Brings us down to our level. Yeah, that's good. Again, I love this verse, and what I've thought about in lured and enticed is the conversation that the serpent had with Eve, because that's what he did.
Yeah.
Is the lure? What are you trying to do with the lure? Get the fish to bite?
Yeah.
You're trying to attract the
Correct.
fish to the thing, right?
Mhm.
And so he's luring her into this with, well, that's not what he said. God knows that when you do this, you're going to be like him. And then she sees, that it's good and it's pleasing to the eye and it's good to the taste and all this stuff. That's fishing.
Yep.
I can fish with a certain fly for 2 hours and catch nothing, and I change to a different fly which they're attracted to.
Boom.
I was just going to say that the ability to fish means you have to have the right lure. Well, there's environment, and so
It's the presentation.
it is. It really is. And the metaphor that James uses is fishing, and so he basically says that the expression kind of drawn away or lured in Greek, it means to be lured by the bait, right? In other words, there is an external temptation, and the devil can tempt us. He obviously tempts us. The world tempts us. So there is a lure and a bait, and the question is whether or not we then want to align our own internal desires to that lure, right? And then we're drawn away. Like the whole thing is like, you're pulling it, the fish starts to follow. Like there's an act of the will, Rich, I think is what you had mentioned earlier. There's an act of the will where we see the temptation, it aligns with that. At that point, though, until you give over, until your will gets over to pursue the lure, to chase the lure, it's still temptation. And that's why James says you can't blame it on the lure. You can't. I know the lure looks shiny. I know it looks really delicious to eat. But
this is where fellowship and where he gets into chapter 5 about sharing one another's burdens. So, and I've done this, where I'm about to do something incredibly stupid.
give me a call, Rich. Give me a
No,
call.
I've done that. I haven't called you,
Yeah.
but I've called other people and say, I'm about to do something that I probably shouldn't do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And it works.
Yeah, I've got people on my list as well where it's like, okay, look, I just need to talk to
You can
someone.
share this with
Correct.
somebody.
I need you to hold me accountable here for whatever is going on, right? But he also uses two different fishing. This one metaphor, but the drawn away or lured is that idea of being lured by the bait. But then enticed is actually a fishing term. Enticed means to be ensnared by a hook. That's what it means. So we are first lured, so we chase the bait, then we bite it and we're ensnared by the hook. So I knew you'd like that, and that is how it works. This word here for being enticed is only used here and in 2 Peter 2 and 14 and 18, right? And basically what it does is there's an emphasis on how deceptive the lust is, right? And when you think about different stuff in your life, when you've given into a sin, it's because we have believed a lie. Like if we honestly believe the truth about what the situation is, I don't think we wouldn't fall hardly at all. If you looked at it and thought, you know what, that's poison. By me doing that, that's going to be poison in my soul. No one would ever drink it. But we get deceived into certain things. We get deceived into things like, I deserved that promotion. I'm not going to cooperate. I'm a pain in the butt. Who cares? That was my role, right? Or you're in a bad relationship. It's like, well, I don't deserve to be treated like that. I deserve to be happy. That person's not fulfilling my needs. Therefore, and we buy into the deceptiveness of the lie, which tells us that the thing's okay. We always find some way to justify our actions, right? Even if we know that we're incorrectly justifying, we still find some way to make that thing, at least in the moment,
Yeah, that's it.
and okay to do, right? And that's exactly what it talks about here, that word has this idea of it's being deceptive. Just like the fish, they look at it and they think, gosh, man, that is a great little bug. That's a deception, right? We know it's a deception. So part of what James is talking about here is that when we meet temptation, we have to identify what the deception is. Because when we identify what the deception is, when I identify what the truth of the situation is, it helps us to identify that, oh, you know what, that's actually a hook. I don't think I want that thing, ripping my, my cheek out, right? And that's why I think he uses these here, is he wants to make sure that we understand that all temptation that would entice us to sin has a deceptiveness to it. There's deceit in it.
I think he's making a distinction too between testing and being tempted. God tested Jesus. And it was an external.
Well, no, there was a temptation. Satan tempted Jesus.
Satan did tempt Jesus.
Yeah.
That resulted from an internal temptation, where God's placing him in the wilderness in the first place was a testing.
Yeah, God allowed him to be tested by being tempted.
Yes.
But God did not tempt him. That's the
Exactly right.
difference.
So
Now,
there's a difference between God testing us
yeah.
and then our being tempted
Now, and
to
if you
deviate from
and if you
how
think
we
about
react in that test, in that time of trial, how are we gonna react?
well, and just take going back to my point that I was trying to make there with the deceitfulness, the deceptions of the temptations of Christ, temptation to eat make bread so that you can eat it. Well, that's actually a good desire, right? You're hungry. You've been without food for 40 days. Nothing wrong with that. But the temptation was to use his divine powers to meet the need in a way that God didn't intend. God intended to actually give him food to eat after the temptation was over. And so, but the deceitfulness about that whole thing is, well, you're God. What's wrong with you? I mean, you created the world. What would be wrong with you creating a piece of bread? I mean, that's a deceitfulness. Like, is there anything sinful if Jesus had taken a rock and turned it into bread? There's nothing sinful about it. There's nothing inherently sinful about that action at all, right? And so, well, if you're God, and because God created everything, there's nothing wrong. Why don't you want to? Why wouldn't you do that? But Jesus understands the deception of that, right? Of what Satan was trying to do to him, and therefore he realized that would be a wrong action in the moment. Whereas, a couple days later, he could have been walking down the road and turned any stone into bread, and it wouldn't have been a sin at that point because it wasn't related to that, right? You see, so that's the deceptiveness of the temptation.
So Larry and I are going out to go see some fish.
Yeah. You're tempting them. Yeah.
And you're more deceptive than I am.
Yeah, and James says that it's by our own lust, it's our own desires that actually does it. So, yes, there's outward temptation from the world and Satan, but it only becomes sin because we also have an inward desire that ends up aligning with the lure,
I wrote down right
right?
here, a little prayer. Dear God, please create an inward desire in me to nurture our relationship and align my desires with your desires.
Correct. 100%.
And the skill is recognizing those deceptions and then taking action against it.
Correct. And now this is why I said you might want to today go and read James 4, 1 through 8, because James is going to then tell us, he doesn't tell us here how to do that. He will, in chapter 4, tell us exactly how to do this, right? So, but you're exactly right. Like there's a very practical way, and it really aligns with what you had just said, with how James says, okay, look, let's talk about this whole thing. We all struggle with it, so let's talk about how we want to actually do that in a way that helps us to be practical Christians. But James then goes on. So he gives us the first metaphor, which is about fishing. The second metaphor is about conception or birth, right? Or it's actually to be more appropriate. It's about a person's life cycle from conception to death, right? And that's sort of the metaphor he's using, because he says lust. In other words, this thing that we have inside of us that wants something, when it has been conceived, then it bears sin, right? It's only when we take action on that there's a conception. We give in. There's an external temptation that aligns with our own internal lust, and when we give in to that, that is the moment that sin is in fact conceived. So until we give in, this is why I said Christians have gotten this wrong all along. For a lot of them, where they've labeled things as evil that aren't evil. It only becomes sin when you actually give in to the temptation, right? Put my head down like this and just box myself from the world and hope that no temptation ever gets to me. That's not the Christian approach. We're to live in the world, not be of the world, but it only becomes sin when we give into that, right?
I struggled with that big time when I was young. Became, what day is this?
Today is the 5th of March.
I struggled with that a lot, particularly with what you took us through in the Fruchtenbaum series,
Yeah.
the Beatitudes, and if you lust, you've committed. If you hate, you've committed.
Yeah.
I went crazy with that. because I thought that every time I had a thought, then I didn't necessarily act on it, that I was sinning. If I heard you correctly, you said that that's not the case.
Well, let's take for instance lust, right? So I can tell you right now, if there's a beautiful woman that walks by, guess what?
You might notice.
Well,
Beyond that, how
look,
far are you
there's a
gonna-
recognition. So there's a clear recognition that she's attractive. Now, there's a recognition there. Now, when that becomes a lustful thought is when then I pursue that and I say, I don't not only recognize the beauty, but I desire that, and then my thoughts then go to whatever it is. So that's the part, though, in Christians where people have said, well, if the thought, if you look at it, oh, she's attractive, it's like, oh, there you sin. It's like, no, you haven't done that. Just like when there's a situation like you talked about, hate, we are all going to have anger. Anger is actually, God gets angry. So anger in itself is not evil. Anger, when it is done inappropriately or for the wrong situations or for the wrong length of time or displayed inappropriately, that's when anger becomes evil. So you can become angry when someone does something, but it's when you then take a non-evil emotion or response and then you focus on, that's what happens with road rage. You get angry when some knucklehead's driving 95 miles an hour on the freeway and cuts you off and almost gets like this. There's an immediate like, what are you doing? But then if I take the what are you doing and I get in my car and I'm like, I'm getting up and I'm getting on his bumper and I'm honking my horn and I'm doing all of a sudden I've taken it and now I'm the one that is pursuing that
Now you're
wrong.
giving birth to sin.
Correct. So when yes.
I struggled with that big
Yeah.
time in my mind because I thought I was supposed to be this guy without, some monk, who, didn't have these emotions and having them and dealing with these struggles, that there was something.
Okay, can I tell you something? So I used to, because I came from I came from a denomination that was very much, I'll call it very legalistic and stuff. And so I struggle with the exact same thing. Like, if you even notice, that a woman's attractive, you've sinned. And so the whole time you're doing, like, literally, you're trying to look, like you're trying to do all this stuff. Someone walks in the room, you're doing this kind of thing, right? Dude, I was going with it someplace. Now I totally lost it. Anyway.
You were brought up in legalistic.
Well, here's what I was going to say. If you didn't notice that someone was attractive, you'd never get married.
Interesting.
Do you notice? I mean, the fact that there is a holy way to actually look at someone and say, "Wow, they're attractive. I could be interested in that person in that way because God designed us to be that way." Does that make sense? Like, no one would ever get married because it would be like, look, I'm not attracted to a rock. Like, there's no enticement for me there. I'd never get married if I had to marry rocks, right? Because they're not interesting.
We can notice, we can feel a desire, but if you can't, you need to take your thoughts captive so that you don't.
Correct.
You can act out things in your mind.
Yes.
With certain people you see, and that's as assaulting on them as if you were.
That's
doing
when
it.
you've stepped over.
You don't
That's
have
when you
permission
stepped over the
to
line.
touch them.
Correct.
But it's taking every thought captive.
Correct.
Right.
And I'm recognizing that more and more. And I just actually talk to my flesh. No, go away. I'm not thinking that.
Correct.
I actually say that to myself.
No.
And it works.
No, 100%. Like, yep, I recognize. Great, I'm moving on.
Right?
Because if I recognize and then I focus on it, then that's where it leads to that. So, fine, great, good, on. And that's every area of our life. But I do think there's a distinction we need to make so that we don't get rich into this weirdness, this like weird thing where you think that you're like sinning all the time when you're really not, or that you just, here's the other side of this. If you take that approach that just the thought or just the recognition is sin, you know what's going to happen? You're going to give up. Because you literally can't live in, you just give up and then you just say, well, who cares? I'm just going to go out and do it then.
I gave up. I said, I can't do this. This is impossible.
Yeah. So when people tell me that they can't overcome sin, usually my first thought is let's get down to the details here to figure out what it is they're doing, because they probably have grown up with that, where they're not appropriately distinguishing between a desire that can be tempted to sin and the sin itself. Does that make sense? So it'll defeat you.
You can't, I know you know, but you can't do it in yourself. But if you're really walking in the Spirit, ask God to fill your mind and your heart, all of a sudden you can live.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't know that at the time.
Yes. There's all. Yeah.
I
I
sin too.
didn't know someone like you.
It's bringing your thoughts captive. It's allowing the power of the Holy Spirit in your life. Like, there's lots of ways. James is going to tell us that we are to draw near to God, and God will draw near to us. He tells us that we're going to resist the devil. Like, there's all these things when you start putting together, that when you say, okay, great, how do I deal with temptation in my life, because it's going to be there? That's how you can do it. And when you don't put all those factors together, you're going to fall, right? You're going to fall. Okay, so anyway, so he uses this sort of life cycle analogy that we have here. So, basically, it gives birth or conceives sin. And then when it says, and sin, what is fully grown, brings forth death. Now, fully grown has the idea of reaching to maturity. So, you might sin once, that gives so you've actually sinned there. Now, the problem is, most of the time, we don't get on our knees and repent and say, I'm not doing that again. What happens is that we do that sin, and then there was some enjoyment factor we got out of that sin, and we allow that sin to grow. So think of, now again, this is not abortion here. I'm not talking about, but there is a correlation of a life cycle of a human. What James is basically saying here is, you need to cut it off before there's conception, right? But if it's conception occurs, you need to cut it off before the thing grows, right? Because once you allow sin to grow, like in the analogy of a human, it becomes mature. And once it becomes mature, guess what? You can't get rid of that. Like, it is so hard, and I think all of us know where we've had certain struggles of sin in our life, where, man, I'm telling you, the longer you allow that thing to hang around, and the longer it's in your life, the harder that thing is to sort of rip out, because it becomes part of your character. It becomes part of almost your DNA that is just extremely difficult to deal with. So James is like, you got to deal with that thing right away, because if you allow that thing to mature and grow, it will consume your life. And then he says, when it is fully grown, it brings forth death. Now, here's the question here. What does James mean here by death? Which death is he referring to? Because there's two concepts out there. The first one is that you can lose your salvation. Right? So if you've grown up in a denomination where you can lose your salvation, then they would say, well, yeah, this is exactly what happens. When you just keep on sinning, and you keep on sinning and sinning, then you lose your salvation. So death means that you are no longer saved, and you are spiritually dead, and you're not saved anymore. You're gonna,
Somebody has that attitude.
I'm just saying.
I get what you're saying, because you can harden your heart, have your heart hardened, and succumb fully into turn yourself over to a desire.
Yeah.
Then the more you do that, the more hardened it is. To turn from it is difficult. You can be spiritually dead that way.
Yeah, but it's not. So what I'm talking about here is the fact that you've lost your salvation. Yeah. No. And I
think of this as more two things. Death is, to me, defines separation from God. You're separated from the
That's not what death is.
What's that?
That's not what death is. Death is death.
Okay, so you're talking about physical death?
Yeah, and when we talked about, remember back in Fruchtenbaum, there is a separation from God that happens when the evil are annihilated in hell. He meant they would physically die. Because remember when he said, in the day that you eat of it. Now, in the day that you eat of it is used in the Old Testament several times. And what it means is, the day that you do something, your death sentence has been given. Because, and when we see that in the Old Testament, when it's used, the sentence doesn't happen immediately. The sentence can happen years later. So in other words, so when God said, yeah.
Then is said, in this case, is there a sin unto death? Where in a sin can actually
Yeah, but not lose your salvation.
result in your physical death.
Correct.
Is
And
that what he's referring to?
correct. He's doing the same thing that the Apostle Paul says in Corinthians, where you to turn the unbeliever over to Satan, so that Satan can basically destroy
Oh, wow.
the individual. But
Wow.
not take his soul though.
Right.
Yeah. So in other words, what James says here is that, hey, look, as a believer, the writer of Hebrews says the same thing. The writer of Hebrews says, hey, look, here's the warning. The warnings in Hebrews aren't to losing your salvation. The warnings in Hebrew are to say, look, if you go back, in this case, go back to Judaism to escape the persecution that's coming, you're going to die. And in fact, anyone that did go back died in the destruction in 70 AD. So when they're talking about death here, they're not talking about losing your salvation. They're talking about, and James in this case right here says, look, you keep on doing this, it's going to lead to your death.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
So don't do it. And it's a consistent warning. So anyway, this is the whole cycle here. Yeah.
This may not be true, but I've always thought for a believer, death to any reward.
Well, that could be a lot. You're right. It could be a loss of benefit. I think in here he's talking about actual death, but you're right.
Okay.
Going back to the blessings, though, the blessings that James says we get that when we persevere. So here's the other thing about sin and being deceptive. We think that when we sin, there aren't any consequences. Right? You tell yourself that all the time. I mean, it's there. Implicitly, it's there because if every time we decide, okay, I'm going to go do this thing, what are the consequences for that? And if we looked at that and what is my benefit over here, like if we actually did some sort of a calculation, we'd never do it. Because you're losing an eternal reward. I don't really care about my eternal reward. You'll care about it when you're in eternity. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I don't care about money. You care about it if you just knew that you won the $200 billion lottery. I mean, you know what I'm saying? You just anyway. Yeah, my point is though, or James's point here is that when we allow this to happen, it grows and eventually leads to death, right? So really, the way to keep it from being full grown is what?
Nip in the bud.
Nip in the bud.
Don't be deceived.
Yeah. 1 John 1:9, right? We confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins, right? So this is really James' point here, is that it brings forth death. So we're going to kind of end it here for that. Actually, we're not going to get it. We're not going to get to verse 16 and 17 because we still. So if you want to read verses 16, 17, and 18 for next week, go ahead and do that. So we'll kind of cover that again. I'll just read through it here just so you can kind of get the context now. So he's given the negative side here. Remember, he's talked about persevering. He's talked about the blessings. Then he said, don't blame your lack of perseverance then on God. It all is on you. But then in verse 16, so I just want you to think about what James is doing in 16, 17, and 18. Okay? It says, do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. And then he goes on in verse 18, where he says, of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be kind of first fruits of his creatures. So after James has given us the negative side, that don't give me any excuses for why you aren't persevering. Don't blame God. It's all you. And later on, I'm going to tell you how to resist the devil. I'm going to tell you how to draw near to God. I'm going to tell you the mechanisms for doing that. Then he just says every good gift comes from God. So I don't want to answer that today. I just want you to kind of meditate on that. And then next week, let's talk about because James has a two-part here. He's given sort of this negative side. Now he's given us this other side. What's his point now in talking about every good gift comes down from God? How does that relate to what we've just talked about? All right. So that'll be for next week. Yeah.
What was the verse where saying if you draw near to me?
Oh, it's James 4. So if you read James 4, chapter 1 through 8, and I think it is verse 6 or 7, I think. Or maybe it might be 8. I can't remember exactly, but it's in James 4.
8.
8. Okay, 8. Yeah.
Yeah, come near to God and He will come near to you.
Correct. And that's his.
That's the combination.
Correct.
That's the solution right there.
Correct. That is exactly right.
I was while you were doing this whole thing, I was thinking about, those pictures they used to have in the 90s that were like a jumble, and if you looked at it just right, you'd see an image.